The moment Alice Townsend stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1883, the dust swallowed her whole, and she was grateful for it, because dust did not ask her name, did not ask where she had come from, and most importantly, did not ask why she had left. She carried one leather satchel, a small cedar box locked with a brass clasp, and the kind of stillness in her eyes that only comes from years of learning to make yourself invisible in a house that should have felt like home. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned tightly beneath a travel-worn bonnet, and she moved through the crowd at the stagecoach depot with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had long ago decided that taking up space was a luxury she could not afford. Redemption Creek was not a beautiful town, but it was honest about that. The main street ran long and wide, with a general store, a telegraph office, a livery stable, a sheriff's office, a barber shop that doubled as a dentist, and a saloon called the Copper Penny that seemed to exhale music and wood smoke at every hour of the day. There was a church at the far end of the street, and beside it, a schoolhouse that had recently lost its teacher to a cattle rancher from Tucson who had swept her off her feet before the autumn term could even begin. That vacancy was why Alice was here. She had answered the advertisement in the Santa Fe Gazette herself, cutting the notice from the newspaper with precise scissors, while her mother watched from across the kitchen table with that familiar expression. The one that looked like worry, but was really something closer to relief that somebody else might finally manage the problem of Alice. The problem of Alice was that she thought too much, spoke too plainly, read too many books, and had, 3 years prior, ended an engagement to a perfectly suitable man named Gerald Hutchins, a bank clerk in Albuquerque with neat fingernails and cold hands, who had told her that a wife's opinions were best kept to herself unless specifically invited. She had returned his ring on a Tuesday morning and been called difficult every day since. So she had answered the advertisement, packed her leather satchel and her cedar box and her considerable stubbornness, and now she was standing in front of Redemption Creek with the afternoon sun pressing down on her like a flat iron. "You the new schoolteacher?" The voice came from behind her, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had never been in a rush in its entire life. She turned around. He was leaning against the post of the stagecoach depot's covered porch, arms crossed, one boot hooked over the other at the ankle, and he wore the look of a man who was genuinely curious about the answer but would not have his day ruined either way. He was perhaps 28 or 29, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 3 or 4 days. His hat was a dark gray felt with a sweat stain at the band, and his eyes were the particular shade of hazel that changed depending on what the light was doing gold in the afternoon sun, she would later discover, and near green in the shade. "I am," she said, "Alice Townsend. Milton Donovan." He pushed off from the post and came toward her with his hand extended. She shook it. His grip was firm but not punishing. "I drive supply runs for this county. The school board asked me to bring your things up to the boarding house, seeing as I had space on my wagon. I only have the one satchel," she said, looking at it. He looked at it too. Then he looked at the cedar box tucked under her arm. "And the box I carry myself." He did not argue that. He simply nodded in the way of a man who understood that some things were not up for negotiation and saw no reason to waste breath on them. "Boarding house is 2 streets back. Mrs. Calloway runs it. She'll have supper on in an hour." "Thank you, Mr. Donovan. Milton's fine." He picked up her satchel before she could protest, and she decided to let it go because the afternoon sun was genuinely terrible and she was tired from 3 days on the stagecoach. "You come from far?" "Albuquerque," she said, walking beside him. "Family there?" "Yes." A pause. He seemed to understand that she was not going to elaborate, and he did not push. They walked in a quiet that was surprisingly easy for 2 people who had known each other for approximately 4 minutes. Mrs. Calloway's boarding house was a wide, two-story adobe building with a red geranium on every windowsill and a cat sleeping in every patch of sun on the porch. Mrs. Calloway herself was a stout, cheerful woman in her late 50s with silver hair and no tolerance for nonsense, which Alice appreciated immediately. "Rooms on the second floor, east-facing, so you'll get the morning light, Mrs. Calloway told her, taking the satchel from Milton with the efficiency of someone who had been managing people's luggage for decades. "Supper's at 6, breakfast at 7. I don't do laundry on Sundays, and I don't allow gentlemen callers above the porch." She said that last part with a pointed look at Milton, who raised both hands in a gesture of innocence that suggested he had been the subject of that rule before. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway," Alice said. "The room sounds perfect." When she was shown upstairs, she set her cedar box on the windowsill and looked out at the street below. She could see the church and the schoolhouse from here. She could see the mountains in the distance, the Sandia Range still holding snow on its highest peaks even in April, and the desert floor spread wide and golden between there and here. It was not beautiful the way that paintings were beautiful. It was something rawer and more honest than that. She opened the cedar box. Inside, beneath a piece of folded muslin, were three things: a small book of poems by Emily Dickinson, a pressed wildflower she had picked herself on the road to Albuquerque 7 years ago, and a letter she had written but never sent, addressed to no one in particular, that began with the words, "I am not sure I know who I am when someone else is watching." She closed the box and locked it again. She was starting over. She was going to be careful this time. The schoolhouse opened for the spring term on a Monday, and Alice threw herself into it with the single-minded focus of someone who was grateful to have a purpose. There were 14 students, ranging in age from 6 to 15, and they arrived that first morning with the usual mixture of curiosity and skepticism that greeted all new teachers. The oldest was a girl named Ruthie Holt, 15, who watched Alice with intelligent dark eyes and an expression that seemed to be calculating whether the new teacher was worth the effort of paying attention. Within 2 weeks, Ruthie was staying after school to discuss Dickens. The youngest was a boy named Samuel, 6, who could not yet read his own name but made up for it with an extraordinary determination that Alice found deeply charming. She established routines. She organized the schoolroom, replaced the crumbling map on the wall with a newer one she ordered from Santa Fe using money from her own salary, and she began to feel the particular satisfaction of work that mattered. On the days when everything went well, she almost forgot to miss whatever it was she thought she might be missing. Milton Donovan came back to town every 10 days or so with his supply wagon, and on each visit he managed to appear within comfortable nodding distance of wherever Alice happened to be at some point in the day. It was not aggressive. It was barely even intentional, she thought. He would be tying his horses up outside the general store, and she would be coming out with chalk and writing paper, and they would nod at each other. Or she would be at the post office, and he would be posting letters of his own. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into the term, she was sitting on the schoolhouse steps after the children had gone home, grading the week's arithmetic papers, when she heard his wagon coming up the main street. She watched it without looking like she was watching it, which was a skill she had spent years perfecting. He parked the wagon, saw her on the steps, and without any particular fanfare came over and sat down on the bottom step with his hat in his hands. "How's the teaching going?" he asked. "Well," she said, "better than expected." "What were you expecting?" "Resistance," she said honestly. "New teacher, new ideas." Some of the parents were not entirely pleased when I told them the girls would be learning the same mathematics as the boys. Milton turned his hat around in his hands. "Who complained?" "Mr. Holt primarily, then the Websters." "Holt's not a bad man," Milton said. "He just hasn't been asked to think about things that way before." "I didn't ask him to agree with me," Alice said, returning to her papers. "I just told him that was how the school would operate." A small pause. She thought she heard something very close to a laugh, quickly controlled. "And what did he say to that?" "He said he'd speak to the school board." She marked a correct answer. I told him I hoped he would because the board had approved my curriculum before I arrived, and I'd be happy to show him the correspondence. This time he did laugh, quiet and genuine, and she found herself fighting a smile of her own. She kept her eyes on the papers. "You're not what people expected," he said. "What did they expect? Someone softer, I suppose. Someone who'd smile a lot and not make anybody uncomfortable." "I can smile," she said. "I know you can. I've seen you with the children. You're different with them." She looked up at that. He was watching the street, not her, his forearms resting on his knees, hat loose in his fingers. There was nothing calculating in his observation. It was simply what he had noticed, stated plainly. "Children are easier," she said after a moment. "They haven't decided yet what you're supposed to be." He turned to look at her then, and there was something in his expression that was careful and warm at the same time, like he understood exactly what she meant and thought it was worth sitting with. "No, I suppose they haven't." They sat there for another quarter hour, not speaking very much, while the street settled into its early evening rhythm and the light turned amber over the rooftops. It was the most comfortable she had felt in a long time, and she noticed that with the same precision she noticed everything, catalogued it, examined it, and then set it slightly apart from herself so she wouldn't have to decide what to do with it. April turned into May with a slow, warm generosity. The desert bloomed in a way that Alice had not expected. The scrubby landscape suddenly dotted with yellow and magenta, and she began taking walks along the trail east of town on Saturday mornings to clear her head and remember who she was when no one was looking. She was on one of those walks when she came across the Navajo woman sitting beneath a juniper tree with a child on her lap and a basket half-woven beside her, and the woman looked up at Alice without fear or apology and said something in Dene that Alice did not understand. Alice stopped. She looked at the woman and the child and the basket. "Good morning," she said, feeling slightly foolish for saying it in English to someone who clearly did not speak English. But the woman smiled, a small, specific smile, and Alice smiled back, and they regarded each other for a moment in the full and honest knowledge that they had no shared language, and that this did not make one of them lesser than the other. Alice thought about that exchange for the rest of the day. She thought about the particular injustice of a world in which the people who had been living on this land for centuries were expected to make themselves legible to those who had arrived and claimed it. She thought about her students and how she could do better in the schoolroom, and she began writing letters to a Dene-speaking interpreter in Santa Fe to ask about resources and vocabulary guides. It was something she could do, so she would do it. She told Milton about it one evening in late May, over coffee at the Copper Penny, which served coffee in the daytime and whiskey at night, and managed to be the social center of the community regardless of what hour it was. They had fallen into the habit of coffee when he was in town, without ever quite discussing it or making it official. He had simply been at the counter one afternoon when she came in for a cup after school, and she had sat down next to him, and eventually the coffee had become a given on the days he was in town. "You wrote to Santa Fe for vocabulary guides," he said, turning his cup in his hands. "For the Dene words I'd need most commonly. Health, emergency, the names of things. In case any of the Navajo children ever come to the school. Do you think they will?" She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "I don't know, but I want the door to be open if they do. I think it matters that the door is open even if no one comes through it yet." He looked at her with that expression he sometimes had, the one she was slowly learning to read as quiet admiration, though she was careful not to trust her own reading too much. "You think about things from the outside in," he said. "Most people start from the middle. From their own comfort, you mean?" "Yes," she looked at the window. "Comfort has not always been very reliable in my experience. I'd rather start from what's right." The day he told her something real about himself, it was raining. True rain was rare in Redemption Creek, and when it came with the drama of a grand gesture, sheeting down hard and fast and drumming on the tin roofs until conversation required elevation. They had both ducked under the overhang of the general store at the same time, arriving from different directions, and found themselves standing shoulder to shoulder watching the street dissolve into rivulets. "You have family nearby?" she asked. They had talked around the edges of this before without going in. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to redirect the question. "No," he said. "My father died when I was 19. My mother passed 2 years after that. I have a sister in Colorado. She married a miner, we write. I'm sorry about your parents. My father was a good man who worked himself to nothing. My mother was the kind of woman who made everything around her beautiful without making a fuss about it." He paused. "I think about her when I see someone do something generous when nobody's looking." Alice kept her eyes on the rain. Something in her chest moved, careful and slow, like a door being opened very gently so it wouldn't creak. "The supply runs," she said. "Is that what you always wanted to do?" "No," he said it without bitterness. "I wanted to run cattle at one point. Had a small place south of here with a man named Tom Greaves for about 2 years. Good land. What happened? Tom died of fever in the winter of '79. A pause. I didn't have the heart to run it alone. Sold the land to the ranch to the east and took up the supply runs. Seemed useful. I like moving." "You like not being fixed in one place," she said, and it was not quite a question. He turned to look at her. "Is that a judgment?" She met his eyes. "No, I understand it actually." She looked back at the rain. "I spent years in the same rooms with the same expectations and the same hours, and I thought that's what permanence was supposed to feel like. It didn't feel like anything in the end. Just wait." The rain picked up pace, and then, with the sudden caprice of a desert storm, stopped entirely. The sun broke through the clouds so fast and golden that it almost seemed theatrical. "Come on," Milton said and pushed off from the wall. "Where?" "I know a place you can see the whole valley from. You should see it like this, right after the rain when everything goes gold." She should have hesitated. She noted the fact that she did not. She simply followed him, out past the livery stable and up the slope behind the church, to a flat outcropping of rock that faced west, and when she saw the valley below in the after-rain light, with every surface shining and the mountains standing blue-gray and enormous behind it, she felt the particular sensation of a place fitting itself around her. "Oh," she said, "just that." He stood beside her without saying anything, because there was nothing useful to add to that view. After a long while she said, "Thank you for bringing me here. Seemed like something you needed to see," he said. She did not know what to do with the careful way he paid attention to what she needed. She stored it in the same place she stored everything else that frightened her with its warmth, and she walked back to town beside him in the golden aftermath of the storm, and she was not ready for any of it, but she was aware of it. She was aware of all of it. June brought heat and the closing of the spring term, and with it, a school board meeting at which Alice presented her plans for the fall curriculum, including the expanded mathematics for the girls and a history component that included, however briefly, an acknowledgement that the land they were sitting on had a longer story than the one that began with European settlement. She knew going in that it would not be universally welcomed. Mr. Holt was on the school board, as was Mr. Willard Webster, who owned the feed store, and a soft-spoken rancher named Dale Prout, who generally went along with whatever the last person to speak had said. The fourth board member was a woman named Edith Crane, who was a minister's widow and who surprised Alice by saying, quietly but firmly, "I think it's right. My husband always said a man who doesn't know the full story of where he stands can't stand properly." The vote was 2-2, and the board chairman, a lawyer named Patterson who only came in for official votes, broke the tie in Alice's favor, primarily because he read widely and found her curriculum historically defensible. She walked out of that meeting into the warm June evening with her heart still going quickly, and found Milton sitting on the steps of the building, waiting. "How'd it go?" he asked. "I got what I wanted," she said. He stood up and smiled, and it was a full, uncomplicated smile that reached his eyes and stayed there, and she had to look away. "Can I walk you home?" he asked. She looked at him sideways. "You always ask like you think I might say no." You might, he said simply. I'd rather ask. She considered that. The last man who had wanted to walk her home had not asked, had simply assumed, and when she had wanted to walk alone had treated it as a slight. Yes, she said. You can walk me home. They walked slowly, because the evening was beautiful and the jasmine someone had planted along the wall of the church was doing exactly what jasmine was made to do, and the Milky Way was beginning to show itself overhead like a secret being let out gradually. I want to ask you something, Milton said, and you can tell me to mind my own business. I'll decide after I hear the question. He smiled again briefly. You came here alone. You don't mention the family in Albuquerque unless I bring it up, and then you say as little as possible. You keep the cedar box on the windowsill and you carry it yourself. I'm not asking about any of that. He stopped walking. She stopped too and looked up at him. I'm asking if you're happy right now in this place. The honesty of it hit her low and soft like warm water. She was quiet for a moment, truly considering. I think I am, she said carefully. More than I expected to be, but I'm waiting for the thing that ruins it. What thing? There's always a thing, she said. Someone who wants you to be smaller, or someone who wants you to stay still when you need to move, or move when you need to stay still. She looked down at the packed earth of the street. I spent a long time trying to be whatever shape the room required. I lost track of my own shape. He was very still, the way he could be, the way that made you feel that he was genuinely listening and not simply waiting for his turn to speak. What's your shape? He asked. She looked up at him. The Milky Way was fully out now. I'm still finding out, she admitted. I know some of it. I know I need to be useful. I need to read things that challenge me. I need silence sometimes, and I need to be able to say a difficult thing without being punished for it. I know I need more than I was ever told I was allowed to want. That doesn't sound like too much, he said. It's been too much for most people in my life, she said, and she heard the flatness in her own voice, the place where all the old arguments had been flattened down. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, well, I don't think it's too much. She searched his face for the thing that was always there eventually, the tolerance that was really waiting for her to fit herself back into a smaller shape, the patience that was really a form of management. She did not find it. She found instead something that looked very much like sincerity, and that frightened her more than anything, because sincerity could be disappointed in, and she was too tired to survive another disappointment. Good night, Milton, she said, and walked the rest of the way to Mrs. Calloway's alone. He let her go. He did not call after her or make it strange. He simply tipped his hat to the empty space where she had been and walked back toward the livery where his wagon was parked, and she watched him from a distance, and something in her chest made a sound that was not quite a word. The summer was long and slow in the particular way of desert summers, the heat pressing everything to its lowest and most essential form. Alice spent her days preparing for the fall term, corresponding with the interpreter in Santa Fe, who had sent her a preliminary Dene vocabulary guide, and the name of a Navajo woman in a settlement 2 miles north of town, who sometimes served as a go-between for families interested in schooling. She rode out to meet the woman on a Saturday in July, borrowing a horse from the livery. The woman's name was Yolanda, a name given by missionaries that she wore like a coat someone else had put on her but had found unexpectedly warm. She was 40 or so, with a daughter Alice's age and 2 grandchildren who watched the proceedings from a careful distance. Yolanda spoke English with a clarity and precision that shamed Alice's own occasional imprecision, and she had strong opinions about what the schoolhouse could and could not offer. My granddaughter learns from her mother and her grandmother already, Yolanda said, sitting under the shade of a pinon tree in the hard afternoon heat. What your school teaches is one kind of knowing. She already has another kind. You understand? Yes, Alice said. I do understand. I'm not trying to replace anything. I'm trying to make space. Yolanda studied her for a long moment. The last teacher tried to make them like him, left the parts of themselves behind to fit through his door. I know. Alice felt the weight of that truth, how much damage had been done by people who called it help. I won't do that, but I also won't pretend I don't have limitations in what I can offer. I think honesty about that is more useful than promises. Something shifted in Yolanda's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of consideration. My granddaughter's name is Saya. She is 9. She learns quickly. I would be honored to have her. Yolanda nodded once deliberate. We'll see what September brings. Alice rode back into Redemption Creek in the long golden light of late afternoon, and Milton was there, parked outside the general store with a half-unloaded wagon, and he straightened up when he saw her coming in on horseback, and something in his face did a thing she would have to think about later. "You ride?" he asked as she slid down from the horse. "Not well," she admitted, handing the horse off to the livery boy. "But adequately. Where were you?" "Out north of town." She hesitated, then told him about Yolanda and Saya. She watched his face while she talked, which was something she had started doing without deciding to, tracking the small movements of his expression because they were always honest and almost always good. "That took courage," he said when she finished. "It took a horse and 4 hours," she said, though she was not entirely dismissing what he meant. "Those two," he said. He tilted his head toward the copper penny. "Coffee. It's too hot for coffee. They have lemonade in the summer." She thought about the walk back to Mrs. Calloway's and the heat of her room in the late afternoon. "Yes, all right," she said. And they sat at the corner table by the window with their lemonade sweating in the heat, and she told him about the vocabulary guide and the plans for the fall, and he told her about a difficult run he'd had through Apache Canyon last week when a wheel had cracked at the worst possible time, and he'd had to jury-rig a repair with rope and his own belt, and the patience of a man who knew that panicking would not fix the wheel faster. She laughed at the part about the belt. "And your trousers?" "Still on," he said, and his own grin appeared slow and real. "Barely. It was an undignified afternoon." She laughed again fully, and it felt good in a way that laughter had not felt for a while. He was watching her laugh, and when she caught him watching, he did not look away like a man who had been caught doing something wrong. He just smiled, and she let herself smile back, and for a moment there was nothing in the world but this table and this lemonade and the man across from her who seemed, inexplicably and without any pressure at all, to be genuinely glad to be where he was. She was not ready for that. She knew she was not ready. But she was noticing it. And the noticing was beginning to feel like something she was not going to be able to talk herself out of indefinitely. The fall term began in September, and on the second day, Saya arrived at the schoolhouse door with her mother, who was Yolanda's daughter and who wore the expression of a woman doing something against her better judgment, and doing it anyway because she believed in her daughter. Alice met them at the door and said good morning, and took Saya to the desk she had set aside near the window with extra paper, and the vocabulary guide already laid open to a useful page. The other children were largely curious and largely decent, with the exception of a boy named Carrie Fuller who whispered something to his neighbor that made Saya's jaw tighten, and Alice stopped what she was writing on the board and said, without turning around, "Carrie, if you have something to say that's worth the class's time, please stand up and say it." Carrie did not stand. He did not whisper again. Ruthie Holt, the oldest girl, appointed herself a sort of unofficial guide for Saya without being asked, in the practical and undemonstrative way of someone who simply decided something needed doing and did it. Alice watched this happen and felt a specific gratitude for Ruthie that she made note of privately. By October, Saya was reading simple sentences in English, and Alice was learning the Dene words for colors and numbers from Yolanda, who had begun coming to the edge of town on some Saturdays, which was either a gesture of trust or a practical measure to check on the arrangement. Alice suspected it was both. The thing that changed between her and Milton happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon in the middle of October, with nothing particular to mark it except the quality of the light. She had walked out to the flat rock behind the church, the one he had shown her in May, with her Dickinson book and a blanket and the intention of reading alone for 2 hours, which she had done every Sunday when the weather permitted, and which she considered a private act of self-preservation. She was reading when she heard his boots on the trail and looked up to find him, hat in hand, looking mildly abashed in a way she had never seen on him before. "I saw you head this way," he said. "I've been meaning to come up here myself. If you'd rather be alone, sit down," she said. He sat not too close on the far edge of the rock and pulled a folded letter from his pocket that he had apparently been meaning to read. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the valley gold and blue below them, the juniper trees rustling in a small wind. After a time she said, without looking up from her book, "This is one of the things I need, you know. I told you months ago." Silence. "I know," he said. "I'm not talking." "No, but you're here." A pause. "Does that bother you?" She considered it genuinely. "No," she said with some surprise. "That's what I'm saying. You're here and I still have the silence. You're the first person that's ever managed that." She felt him go very still. She turned her head to look at him. He had folded the letter and was watching her with an expression that was so open and careful and full of something that it made her breath stop for just a moment. "Alice," he said, just her name, like it cost him something. "Don't," she said, but it came out softer than she intended, softer than a warning. "I'm not going to say anything that requires an answer you're not ready for," he said. "I just want you to know I'm aware of it. What this is, and I'm not in a hurry." She turned back to her book. She could feel her own heartbeat in a way that was very inconvenient. "That's very patient of you," she said. "It's not patience," he said. "It's just that I'd rather wait and have the real thing than move fast and get a polite version of it." She closed the book. She looked out at the valley. The wind came up and moved through the juniper, and somewhere below a hawk rode the thermal without effort. "I've given too many polite versions," she said, "of myself. I don't know if I have them left in me. I'm not asking for them." "I know," she let out a breath. "That's what's frightening." He didn't say anything to that. He just looked at the valley with her, and the sun went on its way, and the afternoon held them both without demands, and it was the closest thing to safe she had felt in years. She turned to look at him one more time. "I told you I was still finding out my own shape. I remember. I meant it. I can't give you something I haven't fully found myself yet. I know that too, and I don't know how to be loved without losing myself." She said it plainly, the way she said difficult things, without decoration. "Every time someone has loved me or said they did, I had to become less of something in order to have it. I'd rather be alone than do that again." He was quiet for a long moment. The hawk had disappeared. The light was going copper at the edges of the sky. "Then we'll figure out what it looks like when neither of us has to lose anything," he said. "I don't know exactly what that is either, but I'm willing to learn it with you." The words landed so precisely on the thing she had been carrying for 3 years that she felt them in her chest like a key turning in a lock. Not a lock that opened everything at once, but a lock that moved, that gave the possibility of opening, that said the door was no longer sealed shut. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. But she felt the possibility of it somewhere behind her eyes, and she noted it, and she said, "All right," very quietly, and she turned back to the valley, and he was there, and the silence held. They did not rush. Everything that happened between them happened at the pace of something that was being done correctly. November brought the first real cold, and with it, the coal stove in the schoolroom burning all day, and the children arriving in layers of wool, and the general community drawing inward in the practical way of desert winters. When the cold that the summer heat had made impossible to believe in arrived with absolute authority. Milton's supply runs shortened in the winter, the mountain passes less reliable, and he stayed in Redemption Creek more often, taking odd work at the livery and the lumber yard and helping Dale Prout with his fence lines when the early cold froze the ground in ways that made post-driving a two-man job. He began having supper at Mrs. Calloway's on Wednesday evenings because Mrs. Calloway had extended him an invitation. She had decided she approved of him, a fact she communicated to Alice with no subtlety whatsoever by saying, "He fixes things without being asked, and he doesn't track mud," which puts him ahead of 70% of the men in this territory. Alice appreciated the Wednesday suppers more than she could reasonably admit. The boarding house table sat 6, and the other regular boarders were a telegraph operator named James Fike and a traveling doctor named Holland who came through every few weeks and otherwise kept a room for emergencies. The conversation was easy and wide-ranging, and Milton participated in it without dominating it, which was a quality she had not realized she missed until she experienced its absence in other settings. After supper, when the dishes were cleared and Mrs. Calloway had retired and James Fike had gone to his room with his newspaper, they would sometimes sit on the porch in the cold and talk, wrapped in their coats, with the stars enormous and close above the desert. He told her about growing up in the Texas Panhandle, the son of a man who ran a small farm that was always one bad season from ruin. He told her about coming west at 17, working cattle, working mines, working anything that needed working, restless in the way of young men with more energy than direction. He told her about Tom Greaves, his partner, with a grief that was old enough to be quiet about itself, but was clearly still there. He told her about his sister Clara in Colorado, whose letters came folded with pressed mountain flowers, who was apparently very happy and said so at length. "She sounds wonderful," Alice said. "She is. She's the most straightforwardly happy person I know. She wanted something simple and she got it and she's grateful. I think that's one of the hardest things, wanting simple things and getting them." "What do you want?" Alice asked. He looked at the stars. "Used to be I wanted land, cattle, something to build." A pause. "Now I think I want something that's the right kind of permanent, not locked in, just chosen every day." She understood exactly what he meant, the difference between permanence as a cage and permanence as a continuous decision. "I've been afraid of permanence," she said. "I know, because the permanent things in my life have all required me to be smaller in order to fit." "That's not permanence," he said. "That's just a bad fit." She looked at him. He was looking at the stars still, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. She said, "You're very good at saying the right thing." He glanced at her then. "I'm saying what I actually think. I can't always guarantee those are the same." She smiled, which happened more and more easily in his company. "I know. That's what makes them the right things." Christmas came to Redemption Creek with a school pageant that involved 14 children, a paper star that kept falling off the wall, a sheep borrowed from the Prout Ranch that bit Carrie Fuller lightly on the sleeve, and was thereafter forgiven for all previous insubordinations. Alice played the piano at the pageant, an old upright that lived at the back of the schoolroom and was only slightly out of tune, and Milton was in the audience with his hat in his lap, and the expression of a man who was watching something that made him glad to be exactly where he was. After the pageant, the town gathered at the church for hot cider and the minister's abbreviated Christmas sermon, and on the way back through the cold, clear night, Milton walked beside Alice and said, "I have something for you, a Christmas gift. You can tell me it's too much and I'll take the information without complaint." She stopped walking. "What is it?" He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small package wrapped in brown paper. She took it and opened it. Inside was a volume, new and properly bound, of collected poems by Walt Whitman, and tucked inside the front cover was a note in his handwriting that said, simply, "For the woman who is still finding her own shape." "I think it's a good one." She held the book for a long moment. She was thinking about the cedar box on her windowsill and what was inside it, and about the letter she had written to nobody in particular that began with, "I am not sure I know who I am when someone else is watching." She looked up at him in the cold starlight. "I know who I am when you're watching," she said. "I think that's the first time I've been able to say that." His expression did the thing it sometimes did, that careful and open thing that made her feel seen without making her feel exposed. "Alice," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." And then, because the stars were out and it was Christmas and she was tired of being afraid of the right things, she stepped forward and kissed him, brief and honest the way she did most things. His hands came up to her arms gently and he kissed her back with the same quality, and when she stepped back they were both very still in the cold air. "I need to go slow," she said. "I mean that, not as an excuse. I mean that I have to do this right for it to work." "I know," he said. I'm not going anywhere. You drive supply runs. I always come back, he said, and there was a quiet certainty in it that she had to accept because it was simply true, and she had been watching him long enough to know it. All right, she said, for the second time in her life to him. She tucked the Whitman under her arm. All right. January was hard in the way that January in New Mexico territory could be, the cold coming in waves from the mountains, the wind picking up grit that found its way into everything. The schoolroom stayed warm thanks to the coal stove and Alice's strict policy of coats on hooks and boots wiped before entering. And Saya had by now progressed to reading simple chapter books and had developed an especial fondness for natural history, which Alice fed by writing to the library in Santa Fe for anything they could loan on the subject. Yolanda had begun coming to the edge of town every Saturday morning now, and one frozen Saturday in January, Alice invited her in for tea at Mrs. Calloway's. Mrs. Calloway set out the good cups without being asked and treated Yolanda with the brisk, practical respect she extended to anyone she had decided was worth her time. And that was the beginning of a complicated but genuine friendship between the four women. Mrs. Calloway, Yolanda, Yolanda's daughter Nadia, and Alice, that would thread itself through the following years in ways none of them had entirely anticipated. Alice wrote a letter to her mother in Albuquerque in February that was more honest than any letter she had written home before. She said that she was well. She said that she had found work that mattered and a community she was beginning to feel that she belonged to. She said that there was a man, a supply runner named Milton Donovan, who was patient and honest and who made her feel like herself rather than like a version of herself designed to fit someone else's requirements. She said she was going slowly. Her mother wrote back with characteristic restraint, "I am glad you are well. Be careful." It was not a blessing, but it was not opposition, and for her mother it was something close to both. Milton's sister Clara wrote to him in the spring with the news that she was expecting her first child, and he showed Alice the letter with the particular shining pride of a man who loved his sister very much. "She says she's going to name it after our mother if it's a girl, Margaret." He folded the letter carefully. "I should go see her, it's been 2 years. "You should go," Alice said immediately. He looked at her. "I'll be gone 2 to 3 weeks. The world won't stop." "I know," he paused. "I'd like to take you, someday, when you're ready." She thought about that, about meeting Clara, who sent pressed flowers and was simply happy, about being someone who was brought to meet a sister. "Ask me again in summer," she said, which was not a no. He left for Colorado in March, and Alice spent the 3 weeks of his absence noticing the specific texture of missing him, which was different from the loneliness she had felt for most of her adult life. Loneliness had been the absence of the right kind of company. This was the absence of a specific person. It was, she decided, a better problem to have. She wrote him a letter, careful and honest, that did not say everything but said enough. She told him the school was well. She told him about Saya, learning the names of cloud formations from a natural history book. She told him she had been reading the Whitman he had given her, and that she thought they had been right to give it to her because it was exactly what she needed. She left a space at the end that she filled with the words, "Come back when you're ready," and then crossed those out and wrote, "I'll be here." He came back in late March with a smoked ham from Colorado and a letter from Clara, and a look on his face that was something between travel-worn and deeply glad to be home. He came straight from the livery to the schoolhouse, arriving just as Alice was letting the children out for the afternoon recess, and she was standing in the doorway with chalk on her fingers, and she saw him coming up the street, and something in her face did something she did not manage to control in time. He saw it. His own expression answered it immediately. "Hello," she said when he was close enough. "Hello," he said. He did not try to kiss her in the middle of the school day in front of 12 children and various passers-by. He simply stood in front of her with his hat in his hands and said, "I've been thinking about you every day." "I know," she said. "I received your letters." He had written her 3 times while he was away. Each letter was in his clear, unhurried handwriting, and each one was a specific and genuine account of what he had seen and felt and thought. No performance of feeling, no attempt to impress. Just honest reporting from a man who found her worth writing to. "How's Clara?" she asked. "Growing," he said with a smile. "She's wonderful, husband's a good man, they have a good life." A pause. "She asked about you." Alice blinked. "You told her about me." "She asked why I looked different." "Different how?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "She said I looked like a man who had somewhere to come back to." The words were simple and they undid her completely, and she was not in a position to show that on a school day on the main street, so she cleared her throat and said, "There's coffee when school is out." And he nodded and walked away, and she went back into the schoolroom and stood for a moment with her back against the wall and her hand over her chest, just breathing. He was a man who had somewhere to come back to, and she was the somewhere. She had been someone somewhere before, but it had always cost her the very thing that made her worth coming back to. This was the first time she felt like the coming back did not require her to be any less than she was. She opened the cedar box that evening, which she had not done in months. She took out the letter she had written to nobody, the one that began with "I am not sure I know who I am when someone else is watching." She read it through. Then she read the last page where she had written in smaller letters, "I want to be loved without being consumed. I want to be chosen without being possessed. I want someone who sees me as I am and stays anyway." She folded the letter carefully. She did not throw it away because it had been true, and she did not erase true things. But she put it back under the muslin with the pressed flower and the Dickinson, and she closed the box and locked it, and she stood at the window looking out at the dark street below and the stars above, and she felt something settle in her chest like dust after rain. Everything still, everything real. April came around again, the first anniversary of her arrival in Redemption Creek, and the town was blooming in the same way it had the year before. Only now she knew every color by name and which trail would show her the best of it. She walked out on Saturday morning and Milton came with her, because she had invited him, which was a thing she had not done with anyone in a long time. They walked east along the trail, not hurrying, the desert opening up around them in yellow and magenta the way it had the year before, and she said, at some point when the view was very wide and the mountains were blue-gray and enormous, "I think I love you." She said it the way she said everything difficult, plainly, without decoration, looking straight ahead rather than at him, because some things were easier to say to the horizon. He stopped walking. She stopped too. She turned to look at him then because she had said it and it had to be witnessed. He was looking at her with an expression that was so full and honest that it made the whole desert feel small. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while. Why didn't you say something?" "Because it needed to come from you first." He said it simply. "It needed to be yours before it was ours." She stared at him. "Milton Donovan," she said. "Alice Townsend," he said back with the ghost of a smile. "I think you're the most frustrating and correct person I've ever known." "Those might be the same thing," he said. And then she laughed and he was laughing too, and the desert held them both in the wide gold morning, and he reached out and she took his hand. And it was that ordinary and that momentous at once. He said it back, not as an answer but as its own sentence, standing in the middle of the desert with wildflowers on either side of the trail. "I love you, Alice." He said it like he had been practicing patience with it for a long time and was relieved to set it down. She tightened her hand in his. "All right," she said, for the third and most important time. They were not reckless with it after that because they were neither of them reckless people. What they were was consistent, which was better. He came for supper at Mrs. Calloway's every Wednesday and walked with her on Saturday mornings and sat beside her at church on Sundays, which the town took as an announcement of things, and was not entirely wrong to do so. In May, on a warm evening after supper, sitting on the boarding house porch in the declining light with the first fireflies just beginning to appear at the desert's edge, Milton said, "I want to ask you something that requires an answer when you're ready and not before." Alice set down the book she had been reading. "Go ahead. Would you marry me?" She had expected it and had not expected the way her heart opened to it, simply and without resistance, like a window put up to let in the evening air. She thought about the Albuquerque life she had left, the ring she had returned, Gerald Hutchins with his cold hands and his ideas about what a wife should sound like. She thought about the letter in the cedar box. She thought about the flat rock behind the church in the valley going gold and the man sitting beside her who had managed, without once asking her to change shape, to make her feel entirely herself and also entirely loved. "Yes," she said, "I would marry you." He was very quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled, long and slow, and she understood that he had been more frightened of her answer than he had permitted himself to show. She found that she loved him even more for having been frightened. "When?" he asked. "When things are right," she said. "The fall term is through in December. We could marry in January. Give us time to plan it properly and give Mrs. Calloway time to celebrate because she will celebrate extensively." He laughed. "She will." He reached into his vest pocket and brought out a ring, a simple band with a small amber stone that caught the last of the evening light, and held it, warm and real. "My mother's," he said. "Clara sent it with me when I came back from Colorado. She said she'd been keeping it for when I found someone worth it." Alice took the ring. She turned it in her fingers, feeling the weight of it, the warmth of the amber and the fading light. She looked at it and then at him. "Your mother had good taste," she said. "She did." He took her left hand and very carefully slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as though it had been made for her, which seemed like the kind of thing she would normally dismiss as sentimental and which she found in this moment to be simply true. "Tell me about her," Alice said. "Tell me what she was like." He did. For the next hour on the porch, with the fireflies coming up and the stars appearing one by one, he told her about Margaret Donovan, who had grown potatoes and sweet corn in the Texas dust and made everything around her beautiful without making a fuss about it, who had read everything she could get hold of and passed the habit to her children, who had told Milton once, when he was 12 and having a hard year, that the right kind of strength was the kind that let other people be strong too. Alice listened, and she held the ring on her finger and felt, for the first time in her adult life, the specific sensation of a future she was looking forward to without also bracing against it. They told Mrs. Calloway that evening, because she was already in the parlor with her knitting and it would have been worse to wait. Mrs. Calloway set down her needles and looked at them both for 3 full seconds and then said, "Well, it's about time," and went to the kitchen to get the good glasses and the bottle of brandy she kept for occasions she had decided in advance to celebrate. James Fike, the telegraph operator, was pulled in and told. He shook Milton's hand and told Alice that she had managed to be the most interesting resident of the boarding house in living memory, and that he meant it as the highest possible compliment. The news spread through Redemption Creek in the practical manner of small-town news, which is to say it had spread completely by noon the following day. Edith Crane brought a pie. The Holt family sent their best wishes, which was notable given Mr. Holt's initial resistance to Alice's curriculum, and which she took as a sign that the school board vote had been more good faith than she had originally believed. Yolanda, when she heard, said nothing for a moment and then said, in a tone that was not precisely warmth but was something in the same family, "The schoolteacher has chosen well." Coming from Yolanda, Alice knew this was a considerable thing. Ruthie Holt, who was 16 by now and had decided she was going to study law when she finished school, which she intended to do regardless of whether anyone thought that was realistic, said to Alice privately, "Miss Townsend, are you sure, not about him, about changing your name?" Alice looked at her oldest student with genuine affection. "I am keeping Townsend," she said. "It belongs to me." Ruthie's expression cleared entirely. "Good," she said. "Now what are we doing for the fall term curriculum? Because I have opinions about Dickens." The summer was the best of Alice's life, which she recognized as a large claim and made it anyway because it was true. She finished the school term with the profound satisfaction of watching Saya, who had arrived in September barely speaking English, write a 2-page natural history report on the juniper tree in clear, carefully constructed sentences. She watched Ruthie argue Mr. Holt into allowing her to borrow his law books, which was either a great victory for education or a source of considerable future inconvenience for Mr. Holt, and possibly both. She and Milton spent the long summer evenings together with the ease of people who had stopped pretending they were not exactly where they wanted to be. He read beside her on the flat rock on Sunday afternoons. She went with him once on a supply run to the small settlement east of the mountains where he delivered flour and lamp oil and the occasional luxury, and she saw the land from the seat of his wagon in a way she had never seen it from horseback or on foot, enormous and rolling and completely indifferent to human anxiety. She found it enormously comforting. He introduced her to the people he knew along his routes, a family named Ortiz who ran a farm northeast of town and sent their twin daughters to Alice's school, a retired Army scout named Phelps who lived alone in a low adobe house and could identify every rock formation within 50 miles by name, an old woman in the mountains who kept bees and sold honey by the jar and who looked at Alice with the specific approval of someone who has correctly identified a person's essential quality from very little evidence. "She likes you," Milton told her, driving away from the old woman's house. "She barely spoke," Alice said. "She spoke plenty, in the way she chooses to." He turned the wagon onto the main road. "She told me last year that she had two kinds of people in her life, ones who made the air heavier and ones who made it lighter. She said you made it lighter." Alice looked at the road ahead. "What kind are you?" He thought about it, which she loved about him. He thought about things before he answered them. "I think I used to make it heavier," he said finally. "I moved around a lot, which means I was never accountable to anything long enough to know what I was actually like. Moving can be a way of avoiding finding out." A pause. "I think I got lighter when I stopped trying to leave before I could be left." She turned to look at him. "What made you stop?" He looked back at her just for a moment before his eyes went back to the road. "You didn't need me to stay. You were perfectly capable of being here without me. So staying felt like a choice I was making, not a thing I was trapped in." She sat with that for the rest of the drive, watching the desert go by in its wide and honest way, and she thought about all the versions of herself she had tried to be for other people and the way this here felt nothing like any of them. They were married in January of 1885, on a Saturday, in the Redemption Creek Church, with the minister who had replaced the previous one and who had a fine speaking voice and genuine pleasure in the ceremony. Mrs. Calloway wore her best dress and cried efficiently, then denied it. Edith Crane played the organ with more enthusiasm than technical precision, which was perfect. James Fike gave a toast that was 3 minutes long and surprisingly moving. Yolanda and Nadia sat in the back of the church, which was an act of attendance that meant a great deal and was treated as such. Ruthie Holt sat in the third row and watched the whole thing with the expression of someone taking careful notes for future reference. Alice wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with small blue buttons, because she had not wanted someone else's idea of what she should look like on this day. Her hair was down and pinned with a single comb, and she carried the pressed wildflower from the cedar box, the one she had picked 7 years ago on the road to Albuquerque, in her left hand, not as a bouquet, but as a small private talisman for the woman she had been when she picked it. When the minister said the words and they said theirs back, she looked at Milton and found him looking at her with the same expression he'd had on the flat rock in October when she said she thought she loved him, open and careful and full, and she thought, this is it. This is what it feels like to be loved without losing yourself. Not a diminishment, an expansion. They moved into a house on the east side of town that Milton had spent 3 months quietly preparing, a wide adobe with good windows, and a room he had painted and set up as a study, with bookshelves, because he knew her, and he understood what she needed before she had to ask for it. There was a porch that faced the morning sun and a kitchen that smelled of pine resin, and a bedroom with a window that looked at the mountains. She brought the cedar box and put it on the mantelpiece of the study. She did not lock it again. That spring, Clara and her husband came down from Colorado to meet Alice properly, and Clara was everything the pressed flower letters had suggested. Straightforwardly happy, deeply warm, and possessed of a 3-month-old boy named James Thomas, after their father, who regarded the world from the security of his mother's arms with the specific serenity of a child who has been thoroughly loved from the first moment. Clara hugged Alice the way sisters did, without ceremony or preamble, and said into her ear, "He wrote me about you before he even admitted to himself what he was feeling. I knew before he did." "What did he write?" Alice asked. "He wrote that there was a schoolteacher in Redemption Creek who made him feel like staying still was the bravest thing he'd ever considered doing." Clara pulled back and looked at her with bright eyes. "I kept that letter." Alice looked across the room to where Milton was holding James Thomas with the careful, slightly bewildered tenderness of a man who had not held many babies and was trying very hard to be adequate to the task. The baby was regarding him with total calm. "I'm glad you came," Alice said. "So am I," Clara said. "Oh, he's so happy. You can see it from across the room." Alice looked. She could. He was looking down at his nephew with his eyes soft and his hands steady and his whole body carrying the particular relaxation of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. He glanced up and caught her watching, and the smile that moved across his face was private and genuine and entirely for her. She smiled back, not carefully this time, not managing the edges of it, all of it fully. In the summer of 1886, Alice learned she was pregnant. She received the news from the traveling Dr. Holland, who had been a regular enough presence in Redemption Creek by then to have a small office next to the barber shop, and she walked home from that office slowly through the afternoon heat with the information settling over her in layers. She wanted the child. She knew that clearly. She also felt beneath the wanting the familiar anxiety. What would it require of her? She knew what it had required of her mother. She knew what society would suggest it should require of her. She was sitting on the porch when Milton came home from the livery, dusty from the day's work, and she looked at him and said, "I have something to tell you." He sat down in the other chair immediately. He read her expression with the literacy of a man who had paid attention for years. "Good news or complicated news?" he asked. "Both," she said. "We're going to have a child." He was very still for a moment. Then a smile broke across his face slowly, like sunrise, unhurried and total. He said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then he said, "Are you all right?" She loved him so much in that moment, the fact that his first question was for her rather than about his own reaction. "Yes," she said, "I'm happy, and I want to talk to you about what this looks like, because I intend to keep teaching." "I know," he said. "The school board may have objections." "Then we'll have a conversation with the school board," he said, without inflection, as if it were simply a thing that would happen and be managed. "Milton." "Alice." He leaned forward in his chair and took both her hands in his. "I want you to be the person you are. That includes being a teacher. That includes whatever you need it to include. We'll figure out the logistics." She looked at their joined hands. The amber ring caught the afternoon light. "You know," she said, "when I was 17, someone told me that the things I wanted were too many, too complicated, too much." She looked up at him. "I believed them for a very long time. And now?" "Now I think they were just too few," she said, "and you are not." He brought her hands to his mouth and kissed them, her knuckles, her fingers, the amber ring. He said against her hands, "I love you, Alice Donovan Townsend." "Alice Townsend," she corrected. "Donovan is on the deed." He laughed against her hands, and she felt the laugh through her bones, warm and real in hers. The school board did have objections, raised by Mr. Webster, who suggested that a pregnant woman and then a nursing mother was not a suitable public figure for the education of children. Alice attended the board meeting, sat down at the table with the school board, and presented a proposal. She would take 6 weeks following the birth and would arrange for Edith Crane, who had a solid education and had expressed willingness, to take the classroom in the interim. After 6 weeks, she would return. Edith, when asked beforehand whether she was willing, had said, "Put me on the books," in the tone of someone who had been waiting to be useful in exactly this way, and was pleased the opportunity had finally arrived. The board approved the arrangement 3-1, with Webster as the dissenting vote, and Alice returned to the classroom that fall with 5 months of pregnancy, and a lesson plan that she had spent August refining and which was, by any measure, the best she had produced. Their son was born in the last week of January 1887, in the bedroom with the mountain view, with Dr. Holland present and Mrs. Calloway, who had decreed her presence non-negotiable and had been correct. He was born at 3 in the morning with the full authority of someone who had been looking forward to arriving, and he announced himself to the household with considerable volume. Milton held him first, because Alice was exhausted and had earned the rest, and he stood at the window with the baby in his arms, looking out at the dark mountains, and Alice watched him from the bed and thought, "This is a man who knows how to hold something gently without holding it too tight." They named him Thomas Samuel Thomas for Milton's father and Samuel, because Alice loved the determined little boy in her classroom who had worked so hard to learn his own name, and who deserved to have his name remembered in this house. Thomas Samuel Donovan, born in Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory, January 1887, while the mountain stood blue-gray and permanent behind the window of a house, where a woman had finally found out she could be loved and still be exactly herself. Alice was back in the classroom 6 weeks later, as she had said she would be. Thomas came with her for the first weeks, kept in a basket behind the piano, which the children took turns checking on at recess with a proprietary devotion that made Alice laugh. Saya, who was now 11 and had become the closest thing the schoolroom had to an unofficial deputy, appointed herself Thomas's special guardian during reading hour, and he slept through most of it, which suggested he had inherited his father's capacity for comfortable stillness. The year turned. Thomas grew into a child with dark hair and his father's hazel eyes and his mother's particular quality of attention, the look of a child who was always watching carefully, taking things in. He walked at 11 months and talked at 14, and his first distinct word, to Milton's visible delight and Alice's amusement, was not Mama or Papa but book, because she had been reading to him from the week he was born, and he had decided which things he considered important. Saya finished school in 1889, at 14, which was as far as Redemption Creek could take her, and Alice wrote on her behalf 3 letters, one to a school in Santa Fe, one to a mission school in Albuquerque that she knew from her own time there had a solid reputation for academic rigor, and one to a Diné Education Committee that had recently been established in Albuquerque by a group of forward-thinking Navajo community members and teachers. The last letter bore the most fruit. Saya went to Albuquerque in September of 1889, sponsored by a small scholarship. Alice and Yolanda had spent the preceding year quietly assembling from donations they had collected with, respectively, absolute charm and absolute determination. She would study there for 3 years and come back, eventually, as a teacher herself, which is a separate story entirely, but Alice would live to see the beginning of it, and that was enough. Ruthie Holt, at 18, left for Albuquerque to study law, because she had decided that was what she was going to do and had simply done it, in the manner of someone who had learned, in 14 years of Alice Townsend's classroom, that a woman's idea of what was possible was worth taking seriously. When Ruthie left, she hugged Alice on the platform and said, "You taught me that wanting the real thing was not the same as asking for too much." Alice held her for a moment. "You taught that to yourself," she said. "I just refused to tell you you were wrong." In the autumn of 1890, when Thomas was 3 and already attempting to read with a determination that would have been endearing if not for the fact that he expected everyone within reach to help him with the harder words at all hours, Alice discovered she was pregnant again. She was 31 years old and Milton was 35, and they sat on the porch in the October evening the way they had sat on the porch for 7 years, and she told him, and his face did the sunrise thing again, and she felt the same expansion she had felt the first time, still clean and still real. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very," she said. "I've been feeling it for a few weeks." I wanted to be sure before I said anything. He reached out and took her hand on the arm of her chair. "What do you need?" "Nothing differently than I have it," she said. "This is a good life, Milton. I want you to know that. It's a genuinely good life, and I know it." He turned to look at her, and in the evening light his eyes were gold in the way they went in warm light, and he said, "Do you remember what you told me on that rock in October, 3 years after you arrived?" "I said a lot of things on that rock. You said you didn't know how to be loved without losing yourself." He looked at her steadily. "Do you still feel that?" She thought about it, the way he had taught her by example to think about things genuinely before answering. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in April of 1883 with her one satchel and her cedar box and her beautiful, hard-won, terrifying self. She thought about that letter in the box. "I'm not sure I know who I am when someone else is watching." "No," she said. "I know how to do it now." It turns out the trick was finding someone who didn't want any less of me than all of it. He brought her hand to his mouth. "I wanted all of it from the first time you told a student to stand up and say something worth saying and they didn't dare." She laughed quietly. Carrie Fuller. Carrie Fuller. They sat there while the stars came out and Thomas slept inside, and the October air carried the smell of juniper and distance, and it was the particular fullness of a life that had been built carefully, from the right materials, with someone who had been paying attention from the beginning. Their daughter was born in April of 1891, on a warm evening with the desert blooming outside the bedroom window and the mountains standing blue-gray and faithful at the edge of everything. She came quickly and quietly, the way some people arrive who already know they belong somewhere, and Milton said when he held her, "She has your eyes." Alice looked at the baby and saw that this was true, the dark, watchful quality in them, the look of a woman already considering what she was going to read next. "Margaret," Alice said, "for your mother." Milton looked up from the baby. He looked at Alice with an expression that went beyond the open and careful and full thing and into something that did not have a name exactly, just a quality of gratitude so complete it had gone past words. "Margaret," he said. "Yes." Margaret Alice Donovan, born April 1891, in Redemption Creek, New Mexico Territory. She came into a world where the schoolteacher who was her mother had made a small, specific, lasting change in the room she worked in, and was still making it. Where the supply runner who was her father knew every road between the mountains and the river and came back every time. Where the household was full of books and voices, and the comfortable argument of two people who respected each other enough to disagree when they disagreed, and to say what they meant always. Thomas, at 4, received his sister with a mixture of skepticism and fascination that quickly resolved itself into devotion, because she looked at him with those dark, attentive eyes, and he had his mother's quality of finding the things that paid genuine attention to him very worth his time. Mrs. Calloway came over with food. Yolanda came with a woven blanket in the particular colors of the desert floor ochre and sage and the blue of high sky that she had made herself, and which was one of the most beautiful things Alice had ever seen. She held it in her hands and said, "Yolanda, this is extraordinary." Yolanda said, without flourish, "The child comes into a good place. She should have a beautiful thing." Alice thought about that for a long time afterward. The child comes into a good place. She had not always been in a good place. She had made this one, piece by piece, from the materials she had brought and the ones she had found here, and the man who had helped her find them without once suggesting she was not capable of finding them herself. She was 32 years old, and she was a schoolteacher, and a wife, and a mother, and a reader, and a woman who had learned that wanting the full measure of things was not a flaw but a direction. And she was in possession of a life that had been worth the difficult road to arrive at it. On the evening that Yolanda brought the blanket, when both children were sleeping and the house was quiet, Alice sat in the study with the open cedar box on her lap. She took out the letter she had written to nobody and read it through one last time, in the good lamplight, while the mountains held their positions outside the window, and the desert breathed its wide and honest breath. Then she set the letter down on the writing table and picked up a pen and wrote at the bottom of the last page, below the line that said, "I want to be loved without being consumed," in her clear and deliberate hand. I found it. It took courage and stubbornness, and a man who was willing to learn with me. But I found it. It is real. It is mine. She folded the letter back along its creases. She put it back under the muslin with the Dickinson book and the pressed wildflower, which was still recognizably a flower though it had been pressing for 12 years now. She locked the box. Then she unlocked it again and left it open, because some things were done being kept. Milton appeared in the doorway of the study with 2 cups of tea, which he had taken to making in the evenings, because, he had noticed, she needed something warm in her hands when she was thinking hard, and because noticing and responding were the language he had chosen to speak with her. He looked at the open cedar box and said nothing about it. He brought her the tea and sat in the armchair across from her desk and opened his own book, and they read together in the comfortable quiet that they had built between them, in this house, in this life, in this particular and extraordinary ordinary evening. The mountains were outside the window. The children were sleeping. The desert went on in all directions, wide and real and indifferent and beautiful, the way it had always been, the way it would be long after all of them had gone, holding the marks of their brief and vivid passing in the stones and the dust and the school records that would remain long after the people in them, and the names that children would carry forward: Thomas, Margaret, Saya, Ruthie, into a future that none of them could see from here, but all of them, in their different ways, had contributed something true and lasting toward. Alice drank her tea and turned her page, and her husband read across the room, and the lamp burned, and the house was warm, and the life was full, and she was herself in it, completely and without apology, and that was the end she had always deserved, and the beginning of everything that came after.